Alright, so we're going to be covering the entire book of Song of Solomon, but before we do, there's a couple things I think we should cover first. One, why would you want to listen to my presentations when you could listen to anybody else's out there, or just get a commentary on Song of Solomon and read it through? Well, let me read to you what famous Bible commentator Adam Clarke said in his introduction to his commentary on Song of Solomon. He says, "It is much better, therefore, if explained or illustrated at all, to take it in its literal meaning and explain it in its general sense. I say general sense because there are many passages in it which should not be explained, if taken literally, the references being too delicate, and Eastern phraseology on such subjects is too vivid for European imaginations. Let any sensible and pious medical man read over this book, and, if at all acquainted with Asiatic phraseology, say whether it would be proper, even in a medical language, to explain all the descriptions and allusions in this poem." So what Adam Clarke is basically saying here is he's like, look, I understand the ancient Eastern phraseology that's being used to describe the sexual things that are taking place in this song, but it is not proper for me to tell you what they are. Therefore, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to explain it in its general sense. I'm not going to tell you what it's actually about, because it wouldn't be proper for me to do so. Now, this is a problem for people when it comes to Song of Solomon, and finding a good source of information on it. One, because either people aren't familiar with the ancient phraseology used and the sexual references and innuendos and stuff, or if they do understand it, they don't feel comfortable talking about sex with their reader or their listener. Does that make sense? And so that's why I believe that you should give my presentations a shot here, because one, I know and understand those, the ancient Eastern phraseologies, and we're actually going to show them to you from the Bible and make it real clear and stuff. And then two, I'm not afraid to just tell you what it is upright and so forth. I think the Bible should be explained, and this is what it's really about, and so forth, and I don't have any problem using words like sex and penis and vagina and so forth. So, now the next thing is, why would you want to study the book Song of Solomon? What value does it have for you? Well, let's read in Ephesians here, a couple verses. Ephesians 5, verses 22 through 32. It says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church, and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." And so what Paul is basically doing here is he's saying that the relationship that is supposed to exist between Christ and the church is how the relationship is supposed to be between a husband and his wife. The one is a symbol of the other, and the one is a pattern of the other. But what does he say there at the end? He says, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh." Now, in what sense can a husband and wife, in its most simplistic form, in what sense can a husband and wife be considered one flesh? What would they do to make themselves one flesh in the highest sense, more than any other thing that they could possibly do? Sexual intercourse. This is when two bodies, two fleshes unite and ultimately become one. But what does he say there? What does he say? He says, "And they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery," but I'm not talking about husband and wife having sexual intercourse becoming one flesh. I'm actually talking about Christ and the church. That's verse 32. So this is why the book Song of Solomon has such value, because Song of Solomon is the story between the Shulamite and Solomon. Now, we're going to show how Solomon represents Christ, and we'll give you verses to evidence of that and so forth. But if Solomon represents Christ, that means that Solomon, in that book, in the book Song of Solomon, Solomon would be a perfect pattern of a husband regarding sexually explicit things. Okay? And that would also mean that the Shulamite would be a perfect pattern of a wife regarding sexually explicit things. Now, the woman, the Shulamite in the song, she does make some mistakes, but in Song of Solomon, Jesus says to her, he says, "Thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot in thee. There is no blemish." So in other words, she is perfect, and therefore she makes a perfect pattern for a wife regarding sexually explicit things. And that is the value that this song has. That is why you want to understand the book Song of Solomon if you are going to be married or if you are married, because basically you have a perfect pattern of a husband, of what how a husband should be and how a wife should be regarding their sexual relationship with each other. And there is insights that are very valuable, and it's also got deep spiritual insights as well, because it's all symbolizing the relationship between Christ and the church. So that's the value that this song has for you. That's why you want to go through it. Now, and I kind of mentioned this when I was talking about Adam Clarke, and he mentioned the Asiatic phraseology and so forth. The book Song of Solomon is loaded with sexual innuendos and metaphors and so forth. And what that is, like for instance, we have some modern ones today. If we say that a woman has her cherry popped, what does that mean? That means that she had sexual intercourse. Okay, she lost her virginity through sexual intercourse. That's what that means if we say that a woman had her cherry popped. There's also one if we say that a woman got knocked up. What does that mean? Well, that means that she became pregnant because she had sex. Okay, and so the Song of Solomon actually is loaded with sexual innuendos and references there, okay? And they pretty much serve as code words. In other words, you're saying something sexual, but you're not actually saying it outright. We're going to say it by talking about cherries and so forth, okay? And Song of Solomon is loaded with these code words. And if you don't understand those code words, you cannot unlock the song. So when we're covering those portions that require us to understand the metaphors, make sure you pay close attention, because without it you won't understand the song. Now, the next thing is that when people approach the book Song of Solomon, when commentators and so forth have approached this book, they don't really know how to handle it, because Song of Solomon is very different in that it uses so many sexual metaphors and so forth, and if you're not familiar with them, you can't understand it. And so it's kind of a weird book. People don't really know what to do with it. But a lot of people will generally agree that Solomon represents Christ, even though I've never actually seen somebody show that from the song, which is kind of odd. But they'll believe this, but they don't know how to put it all together. And so what ends up happening is they will either break the chronology of the storyline of what happened between the Shulamite and Solomon, or they will deny morality or principles, such as, for instance, Solomon represents Christ in the song, but the book mentions that Solomon had wives and concubines. Oh, that would be polygamy. And you can't have Jesus engaged in a polygamous relationship. That would be a problem. So people will just come up with all kinds of different conclusions to try to justify what they already believe is right, and so they'll start denying stuff and putting stuff out of order, and this actually represents the second coming of Jesus, but then we go back in time to, and it's like, whoa, how are you coming up with this? And so it's not convincing, and that's the issue. When you look at these commentaries on it, you might agree with it because you're like, yeah, well, that sounds right, and I don't know anything better, so he's probably right, but it's not convincing. I don't want that to be your experience. What I want you to do is I want you to be able to go through this presentation series and be like, yeah, I'll tell you what that means, because there's actually Bible verses. I'm going to show you right here. And because I make it simple, or that's my goal at least, so that way it's got power. You can be like, yeah, it's really apparent, actually. It's really easy to see. And then you can actually take something with you, instead of it just being, you're listening to this and yeah, it all sounds nice and he's probably right and I'm going to, quote it the rest of my life and act like it's fact, but I don't really have any, it never really struck you, you know what I'm saying? There's no power to it. So, but in order for it to have that power, we need to keep it simple, and so we're going to interpret it in its most simplest form. And so please remember that, because there's going to be multiple different times where we're going to be breaking down verses, and we're going to just take it in its simplest sense. What would it mean if we just took it as simple as possible? Okay, and that's how we're going to approach this. Now, the other thing about this song is there's different levels on it. For example, what you have here is you have the story between the Shulamite and Solomon and what took place in their relationship. And so that's the storyline. But it's not told outright, okay? Because we're using the sexual metaphors there. And now the sexual metaphors make it sound like they're walking through a garden and there's fruit and, you know, they're having a good time, but that's not really what that is, okay? That is, the metaphor is being used to tell what actually and literally happened. Does that make sense? So you have the literal, okay, which is being explained by the metaphors, but then actually all that stuff is there to tell you what is happening between Christ and the church. Okay, so you have three levels there: the literal, the metaphoric, sexual references and metaphoric storyline that's being used to tell you about the literal, and all that's there to represent the symbolic. So there's three levels there, and when I was going through the song and trying to understand it initially, it was really difficult because I was getting hit by these three levels, three storylines, so to speak, and I'm like, wow, man, this is really hard. And so what I want to do when I'm going through it with you is we're going to cover the metaphors so that way we can understand the base storyline, but I'm not going to focus too much on what it means between Christ and the church. One, because it's obvious. Two, because it can get a little bit much, but I am going to cover enough stuff about what it represents between Christ and the church, because I think it's imperative. It's either really deep, valuable insight, or it'll just simply help everything flow better. But I'm not going to focus on that as much as I would perhaps like to, because it can be a lot to take in the first time. So having said all that, Song of Solomon was written in such a way that earlier portions of the song cannot be understood until later portions of it are first understood. And so what I have done is I've collected some of the basic things that you have to understand, and if you understand them, then you can start at chapter 1, verse 1, and go all the way through to the end without having to jump back and forth. I think that's going to be the best way to approach this song. So we're going to get right into it. We're going to start covering number 1 of our 7 points here. Okay, so the first point is that Solomon represents Christ. Now, we're going to cover this in a little bit more detail later when we go through it verse by verse. But right now, I just want to give you enough so that way you can kind of see it there. But again, we're going to cover it more detail, so it'll be more convincing when we cover it. And it's right at the beginning of the song anyway. But I want you to understand this point here, because honestly, a lot of what I'm going to be getting ready to cover in all this song is based on this idea that Solomon actually represents Christ. So here we go. This is Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 8. It says, and this is Solomon speaking to the Shulamite. He says, "If thou know not, O thou fairest among women, go thy way forth by the footsteps of the flock, and feed thy kids besides the shepherd's tents." Now, if you read in the context, basically, the Shulamite was talking to Solomon in metaphor, and she referred to him as a shepherd, okay? And with Solomon, in his response to her, he kind of bites on. He's like, okay, I'll go ahead and go along with that. I'm the shepherd, okay. So to answer your question, what you need to do is you need to, what did he say? Go thy way forth by the footsteps of the flock and feed thy kids besides the shepherd's tents. Why? Because she was actually asking, hey, where can I meet up with you? And he's like, well, go feed your kids besides the shepherd's tents and we can meet up there. Why? Because I'm a shepherd and the shepherd's tents is where I'm going to be at. And this is how you can see that Solomon represents Christ, because what does Jesus say? Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. Okay, I believe that's John chapter 10. And so this is how we can see in the song itself that Solomon does in fact represent Christ. So that's critical point number 1. Now, the next point, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to be very forthright with you about it. The relationship between the Shulamite and Solomon takes place very rapidly, okay? In verse 2 of chapter 1, she's already asking him to kiss her, okay? And they're not even married. They don't get married until chapter 3 or 4. I don't remember which it is. But, you know, that's a little bit, that's bold, okay? And they're actually engaged, I'll just be frank with you, they're engaged in sex before their actual wedding ceremony, okay? And this presents a problem to a lot of people, and for obvious reasons. One, that would be sinful, and that would mean that Jesus is engaged in sin, and therefore it can't be Jesus, and it kind of blows the whole thing out of the water. Well, I'm going to explain it to you in short because I don't want to spend so much time on this here because I can really get sidetracked. It can be its own study, and I want to focus on Song of Solomon. But I do understand that I'm going to need to talk about this sufficiently enough so that way you can see, oh, okay, this is what this really is, so let's keep going. But as I mentioned before, there are issues that we're going to be facing in Song of Solomon, okay? It mentions queens and concubines. Okay, that's polygamy. We have a problem right there. How are we going to deal with that? Well, I have a way to deal with it, and it's very clear, and it all makes sense in context of Song of Solomon. That's the key point to remember. We also have the thing about the desire for incest in chapter 8, and this can be a problem, but we're going to address them, and we're going to show how we don't have to break the storyline's chronology, we don't have to deny morality, we don't have to deny principle. We're going to show all this, but we're going to have to cover it as it comes. So for this point, just because we're gonna get right into it. They're already having sex like in chapter 2 or the end of chapter 1, you could say even, and so therefore we're gonna have to figure something out because they don't get married until chapter 3 or 4. Let me go ahead and read to you. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 22, and we're going to be reading verses 28 through 29. Okay? Verses 28 and 29 of Deuteronomy chapter 22. It says, "If a man find a damsel," pay close attention here, "if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and lay hold on her, and lie with her, and they be found, then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he hath humbled her, he may not put her away all his days." Now, in order to understand this verse properly, you have to understand the context. In the context, there's a case of rape, okay? And there's also a case where it wasn't rape, they engaged in illegal sex and they were stoned, okay? In the case of rape, and again, these cases are described just before these verses that I just read to you. In the case of rape, only the rapist was stoned, okay? Only he was executed, but the woman lived, okay? But in this case, which is different from those other two, this is where you have two virgins, okay, engaging in consensual sex with each other. Now, they're two virgins, they're not married, they're not in any relationship, they're not betrothed to anybody, so they're unclaimed, so to speak. They find themselves engaged in consensual sex, and what happens to them? Are they stoned for fornication? Are they stoned for adultery? See, in every case of fornication and adultery and sexual iniquity, period, they were always executed. But in this case, they were not. Why? I'm going to tell you why. The reason why is because if you look at the fundamental principle of why God has a problem with sexual iniquity, or what the issue is with sexual iniquity, it's bed hopping. God doesn't want you having sex with anybody but your spouse. Well, these people aren't married. They've never laid with anybody. They've never had sex with anybody else before in their life. Okay, they're not engaged or betrothed in any. They're not in any relationship, but they find that they're engaging in consensual sex here, and so. What's God's solution? Well, they technically haven't been guilty of bed hopping. They've not been sleeping with other people. They weren't promised other people. They weren't being unfaithful by lying and sneaking behind somebody's back. They've done nothing but have sex with each other consensually, okay? And so therefore, they're not guilty of ultimately of any sexual iniquity, because the issue is bed hopping, having sex with different people just randomly or and so forth. And so what was God's solution? God's solution was, she shall be his wife. And because he's humbled her, he's not allowed to divorce her. So God solved this problem right there. He's like, so you guys haven't committed, you haven't committed fornication. There was no other relationships that were broken by this act that was done, because you weren't in any. And you've only had sex with each other. You're virgin, so the solution is instead of stoning you, since you haven't done anything wrong, we're just going to make you husband and wife. That way, you do not end up having sex with somebody else. In other words, you had sex with each other, okay, we're going to make sure it stays that way, okay? Because you're not going, we don't want to kill you because you haven't technically done anything wrong, but we're going to make sure nothing wrong happens because now you're married, okay? And that is ultimately what we have, or this is how I explain what's going on here in Song of Solomon, because you have to try to look at this from the perspective of Eden, okay? Today we base, when we're developing a romantic relationship with somebody, we are trying to be careful lest we end up, what? Being guilty of sexual iniquity by having sex, and then the relationship breaking up, and then, what? We're guilty of fornication and or adultery, or playing the harlot, or whatever, or the whore, or whatever you want to call it. Okay? And so we base our relationship very carefully to make sure that these bad things don't happen, right? But in Adam and Eve's time, if they hadn't sinned, see, they didn't know what adultery and fornication was. They didn't know what evil was, okay? Because they hadn't eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And, so if Adam and Eve hadn't done that, then their offspring, they wouldn't know what evil was either, and so they wouldn't try to develop their relationship very carefully around the ideas of making sure they didn't sin. Okay? What would have happened? Probably, and I don't know this for a fact, but probably it would have taken a more nature-based form. They see each other, they spend time with each other, they become attracted to each other, they have sex with each other, now we're going to acknowledge it with a wonderful wedding ceremony and so forth, and they're married for life. Okay? Now again, I can't prove that. But what I'm trying to do here is explain how what's taking place in Song of Solomon isn't necessarily a problem. Now again, I know we have to talk about the polygamy with the queens and concubines and so forth, and we will do that. Okay, but what I'm trying to do here is show you that the issue with having sex with somebody that's not your spouse is bed hopping. Okay, if it's just you and that other person having sex, you're fine. Okay, it's when you start having sex with somebody that's not your spouse, or that you're not betrothed to, that's when it becomes an issue. Otherwise, there's no sexual iniquity. And these people that did this in Deuteronomy, he's like, you're married for life. That solves the problem, okay? And so that's the short version of it. I mean, if I ever need to, I've got extensive, studies on explaining this in more detail. But that's the simplicity of it. If you are two unwed virgins and you engage in consensual sex, God pronounces you husband and wife, and you're not ever allowed to get divorced, because He's going to make sure that you've not committed sexual sin, even though you've had sex with each other. I'm going to make sure that you don't, because now you're married for life. Okay. So that's the short version, but I want to keep moving on because I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, because this is about Song of Solomon, not working out different things in Deuteronomy and the laws and so forth. Okay, so moving on to point number 3, the woman's body. Let's turn to Song of Solomon, chapter 4 and verse 7. Song of Solomon, chapter 4 and verse 7. It says, and this is Solomon talking to the Shulamite, he says, "Thou art all fair, my love, there is no spot in thee." So fair is beautiful. Okay, so thou art all beautiful, my love, there is no spot in thee. There is no blemish, in other words. You don't have moles on you. You don't have wrinkles in your skin, okay? And now what we're going to do is we're going to read in Ephesians chapter 5, which we read before. We're going to go back to Ephesians chapter 5. Galatians, Ephesians. We're going to read a couple verses here. It's talking about Jesus. It says, "That He might sanctify and cleanse it," the church, "with the washing of water by the word, that He might present it to Himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish." And so the physical beauty of a woman is used to represent the character of Christ in His disciple, okay? Or in His church. Does that make sense? And so when you have in Song of Solomon here, it's Solomon talking to the Shulamite, so that's Jesus talking to His church. He says, "You are all beautiful, my love. You don't have any blemish in you." Okay? And here it says that Jesus wants to present it to Himself a glorious church, or the husband wants to present to himself a beautiful wife, not having spots, moles on her skin, or wrinkles on her face or body, or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. And so if you look at these two verses, it becomes very clear that the physical beauty of the Shulamite in the book Song of Solomon is used to represent the character of Jesus Christ in his disciple, which is what? Holy and without blemish. It's beautiful. The character of God is love. And so that is what Solomon is seeing in this woman, in this song. And so again, the point, just to state it very plainly once again, the physical beauty of a woman is used to represent the character of Christ in his disciple or in his church. And this will be important because this is one of those things that would prevent us from having to jump back and forth when we start going through this verse by verse. So those are the first 3 points, and we're going to cover the last 4 in the next presentation. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.